So we've just recently seen how to print shapes to the screen using characters. So we were able to create a triangle using a simple for loop. Now we're going to try to apply this to something more practical, and we're going to create a tic-tac-toe field using a simple for loop, or using two simple for loops. So how are we going to approach this? Well, there are two components to the tic-tac-toe field. One of them is the height. So we're going to try to make 9 kind of boxes. And so that's going to be 3 effective rows of boxes separated by dashed lines. And we're also going to have 3 columns of boxes separated by dashed lines. So what we want to get in the end is, if we just kind of make 3 lines of comments and draw what we want to get in the end is something that looks a little bit like this. And then if we make a new line here, so what we're going to get here, this would be our first line, for example, and then we go down and we would have our second box. So we would have 2 vertical lines here, and then we would go down, and then we would have the separator between the second and the third row coming now, and here we would have our third box. So what we want to get in the end is something that looks kind of like this. So we have our 3 rows here that are separated by dashed lines, and we also have our 3 columns that are also separated by dashed lines. And so we can kind of resemble or show a very simple tic-tac-toe field that doesn't have any values in it yet, but at least we can kind of create this field. So our goal for this lesson is to use loops to create this tic-tac-toe field. Rather than just printing everything out line by line though, we want to do this using loops so that maybe we can do some more intricate stuff with it later. So let's get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to need a loop for the rows. So let's just start off and let's just print this row by row. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a for loop, and we're going to use our keyword for to indicate that we're going to start a for loop, and we'll use our temporary variable row. So for row in, and now if we count here, we want 5 lines. So 1 line for each row, and we also need 1 line for each separation. So we're going to start off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we need 5 rows, 3 separation rows, and or 3 rows with values in them, and 2 rows for separation. So we're going to use the range function to just kind of give us the numbers between the 5 numbers. So we're going to make a for loop using the range function. So we're going to start for row, our temporary variable row, in range 5. So values from 0 up to but not including 5. So the integer values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is going to loop 5 times. And now what we're going to do is we either want to print this or this, or our separator here. So we either want to print a writable row, which could have a tic-tac-toe value in it, or we want to print a separator. And so how would we do that? Well, if we remember from before, we've also looked at if statements. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an if statement to decide whether we want to print a printable row, or a writable row like this, or a separation row like this. And how are we going to decide that? Well, we notice that the first, the third, and the 5th row are the ones that are writable, and the second and the 4th row are the ones that are separators. So we're going to use this, and we're going to say, well, we want to start off with a writable row, and then alternating, we're going to do separation and writable. And so the best way to do this is to check just if the rows are odd or even. So we just want to check if our number is odd or even. And if we have an even number, we're going to print a writable row. And so this is because in programming, if we remember, we start counting it at, so in programming we start counting at 0, and we're actually also starting our range at 0 here. So right now what we would have as our first value of row would actually be 0, and here it would be 1, and down here it would be 2, and this would be our third row, and down here it would be 4. So with our range function, we're going to create the values 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So our row is going to take on the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have to remember that our first row is actually going to be an even number, and this is going to be an odd number. If we were to change it starting at 1 and going up to but not including 6, we would then get the values here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and our row numbers would now change to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because row would take on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now our first row would be an odd number. But let's just start with range 5, and we'll change this. We'll get the number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 here, because that's what we started with. And here the corresponding rows would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So because row will take on the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and each time row takes on a new value, we want to print a new row. And so the corresponding rows that we print in the order would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so that's why these rows are numbered like this, because our row takes on the values starting at 0 up to 4, and each time row takes on a new value, we are going to print a new row. And the first row that we're going to print is the top one, and the last row that we're going to print is the last one. And so our first row should take on the first value we have here, which is 0, and our last row should take on the last value that we're going to have here, which is going to be 4, since we go up to but not including 5. So let's start. Now what we're going to do is we're going to write every time it's an even number, so 0 to 4, we want to print this kind of structure here. So let's just start with an if statement. If, and now to check if it's even, we type in our temporary variable, which has the numbers, or which is going to have the values between 0 and up to but not including 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to check the remainder using this percentage sign here. And we're going to see what remainder do we get if we divide it by 2. And so if it's an even number, it's going to be divisible by 2, and we're going to get no remainder. So if we divide an even number by 2, our remainder is going to be 0, since 2 would fit in a perfect number of times into an even number. So 2 would fit in a perfect number of times into 0, into 2, into 4, but not into 1 and into 3. So if we divide 3 by 2, for example, 2 fits in once perfectly, so that we've got 2, and then we've got a 1 left over. So our remainder, if we divide 3 by 2, would be 1, because 2 fits in once nicely, and then we have a remainder of 1, and 2 doesn't fit into 1, so that's where we get our remainder from. So, but rather for the numbers 2 or 4, for example, that are even, 2 fits in once into 2, and 2 fits in twice into 4, without leaving any remainder. So if row is nicely divisible by 2, so if it's even, if it has no remainder, which is what we have here, we're going to print, and let's just start off simple, and let's just write in these lines first, and we will change that later to make it even more efficient, but let's just start off simple, and let's actually write in this format here. So we've got a space, and then a vertical line, and then another space, and another vertical line, and another space. So this is what we're going to print if row is even. So this is going to be kind of the writable part. And now what we're going to do is otherwise, or else, so if row is not perfectly divisible by 2, or if it's not even, we're going to print a dashed line. So we'll also just write this in like this first to keep it simple. So we'll write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll just have 5 dashed lines to act as a separator. And so let's run this, let's see what we get, and let's walk through it one more time. So what we get is just like what we portrayed up here. We get a writable column or a writable row, then we get a separator row, then we get another writable one, another separator, and another writable one. And so how does this happen? Well, row takes on the value 0 first, which we have here. So if row is, so in this case 0, perfectly divisible by 2, or if we divide row by 2, what remainder do we get? So 0 divided by 2, well, we get no remainder. So we print this here. And now because we've executed this, we don't go into the else. And so now our loop is complete and row takes on the value 1. So if we divide row by 2, well, 1 divided by 2 gives us a remainder of 1. And so in this case, our if statement is not met, and we go into the else. And we print the separator. Now row takes on the value 2, and we check if what is the remainder of dividing 2 by 2? Well, it's 0. So we print another writable line here, and we skip the else because we've executed the if. Now row takes on the value 3, and now if we divide 3 by 2, 2 fits in once perfectly, and we have a remainder of 1. And so we don't execute the if statement because our remainder is not 0, but we go into the else, and so we print another separator. And now row takes on the value 4, and we check is 4 even, or what happens if we divide 4 by 2? Well, 2 fits in twice perfectly into 4 with no remainder, and so we print another writable line, which we see here. Yeah, so this is kind of what this for loop has done. Now, the next thing that we can do is we can make this a little bit more efficient. So rather than writing out the characters that we want to print here, we can make we can kind of recognize that we print either a space or we print a separator here, a vertical separator or a vertical line. So what we're going to do is inside of this if statement, we're going to make this a little bit more efficient in the sense that we don't have to write it out, and we're going to print either a space or a vertical line depending on which column we're in. So if we just kind of make a commented line here and we go below and we number our columns are going to be numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So if we separate this by commas, maybe, well, no, that's going to mess up our formatting. But so we've got the space, which is going to be column 1, and then we've got the vertical line, which is going to be column 2, our space, which is going to be column 3, vertical line column 4, and our space, which is going to be column 5. And so this time we'll use the range from 1 to 6 rather than from 0 to 4, which we've used here. It doesn't make a difference if we use 0 to 4 or 1 to 6. It's just, let's just something different. So we'll just do it so that we can see both. So let's just get down to it. Let's just write it, and then let's, as we're writing it, let's try to understand what we're doing, and then we can run it, and then we can really understand what's going on. So what we want to do is we want to be able to print this using a for loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a for loop inside of our if statement. So we're indented inside of the if statement, and we're going to use for, and our temporary variable is going to be called column. So we're going to do a for column in the range from 1 up to but not including 6. So this is why our columns are going to be numbered 1 through 5 rather than 0 through 4 like we have up here, because we start at 1, which corresponds to our first column, and we end up at 5. So up to but not including 6, so we end at 5, which corresponds to our last column. And so to complete our for loop, we're going to have our colon here, and then we're going to go into the for loop, and now we need to check again if we have an even or an odd column, and we'll print the corresponding value. So let's see, our first value is going to be a space, and that corresponds to an odd number. Our second value is a vertical line or vertical separator, which corresponds to an even number. Our third value is another space, which is an odd number. Our fourth value is another vertical line or a vertical separator, which corresponds to an even number. And our fifth and final value is another space, which corresponds to another odd number. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, if our number is odd, we want to print a space. So if column, and now we're going to do, oops, misspelled that there. Now we're going to do the same thing as we did up here, and we're going to check if it's divisible by 2 perfectly, or if it has a remainder if we divide by 2. So if the remainder of dividing column by 2 is equal to, and now we're going to check if it's odd, so if it's equal to 1, so if we divide column by 2 and we have a remainder of 1, so if we divide something by 2, we either have no remainder or we have a remainder of 1. So if we have a remainder of 1, or if the number is odd, we're going to print a space, just like this. So that's going to give us this value. And else, so if it's not odd, we're going to print a vertical line or a vertical separator, just like this. So this will either print a space if the column is odd, so 1, 3, and 5, or it's going to print a vertical line if the column is even, which is here at 2 and 4. Now, something that we should keep in mind is that something that the print function does is that it prints a new line every time it's executed. So if we write print and then we print it, and what it does is it automatically prints a new line. And so to get rid of that, and to stop printing a new line at the very end, we have to put in a special keyword. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a print statement here, and then we're going to have the string or the word that we want to print, and then we're going to put a comma, and we're going to type in end is equal to, and then we're just going to open and close our quotation marks, or just put 2 quotation marks here. And so what this does is that now when our print function ends, it's not going to print a new line like we get here every time, so we automatically get a new line. It's going to print this. So this is how it's going to end. And this doesn't really correspond to anything, so we're not going to do anything extra there. So rather than printing a new line, we're just going to stay on the same line. So that's what this does. And we'll also do the same thing here, because we also want to stay on the same line here. So we're going to change our end, and we're going to make it equal to, now, just double quotation marks. Now, don't worry, we'll visit this again later too. And so this is just, we'll just see this in action in a second, and then it would also make a lot more sense. So don't worry about this part too much right now. We'll see it in a second why we need it, but we'll also go through it again in later tutorials. So this is just for a formatting thing, so that we don't print the space and the vertical separator on new lines. And we'll see examples of what happens when we don't have this in too. But really, just don't worry about this. This is just one of those formatting things that you can add to the print function, and it will be covered in a later tutorial too. And since we're printing all of this in this for loop here, we can actually get rid of this. So let's comment this out. Yeah, so let's just run our loop again, and let's see what we get. So if we run our loop, well, what we get is we print either vertical lines, or we print the horizontal separators. And now why does this happen? Well, this happens because of this end thing that we did here. So we say we always want to stay on the same line, which applies to the vertical separator too then. So after after we've printed our final space, we're going to stay on the same line. And so now what we have to do is we have to add another if statement inside of this if statement. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, if our number, or if our column is not equal to 5, so if it's not the final value, we're going to print it without any separation, so we'll print it on the same line. But if it is on the final line, then we are going to print a new line. So if column is not equal to 5, and so this is just because we know our last value is going to be 5, what we're going to do is we're going to print a space, and the next character is also, or the next string is going to be on the same line. And now else, so if our column is 5, so if it is the final value, we're going to print, whoops, so on a new line, we're going to print just a space. And now, because we don't add this extra format or this extra end saying that our when we end the print, we're going to stay on the same line, and what it automatically does is that the print puts us on a new line. So let's run this, let's go through it in detail, let's understand everything that we did. So if we run it like this, we get the formatting, which is great, but we've done it through using this complicated kind of loop here, or several loops rather. So let's just really go through this in detail, and let's just really understand what happened, what happens with all these if statements, what happens with all these extra for loops, how does this all work? So we start off with our for loop, so for row and range 5, so row is going to take on the values between 0 and up to not including 5, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to check if the remainder of dividing row by 2 is 0, so if row is even, we're going to enter this segment here. So all of this here is going to be in this if statement, and so that's because all of this is indented inside of this if statement. And so what happens if row is divisible by 2, or if it's even? So let's just start with, well, row starts as 0, so if 0, the remainder of dividing 0 by 2 is 0, which it is, but now we enter this if statement. So we start with another for loop now, and so now we go into a for loop. So for column in range from 1 up to but not including 6, so column is going to take on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now we're inside this if statement, and now column is going to take on values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so now we go inside this for loop. So inside of this loop, we go inside of this statement right here, because we start with the number 0, and 0 dividing by 2, and the remainder is 0. And so now we're inside this if statement. And now the first thing we do is we enter another for loop. And so now row has the value 0, and now column takes on the first value here, which is 1. And so now we check, if we divide column by 2, what is the remainder? Well, dividing 1 by 2, we get a remainder of 1. So now we go inside of this if statement here. Oops, inside of this if statement here. And now we check if column is not equal to 5. So what is the value of column? Well, the value of column currently is 1. So 1 is not equal to 5. So we go into this this if statement, and we print a space, and our end separation is nothing, so we print the next thing on the same line. So yeah, so now we've gone into this if statement. So we jump out back here, and since we've gone into this if statement, we don't go into this else, and so we jump out, and now column is going to take on the second value, so it's going to be 2. So let's just kind of write and follow here what happens. So when our column is 1, we've gone into this if statement, and we've printed this. So that gives us our first base. Now column takes on the value 2. So we don't leave this loop until column goes all the way through the loop and up to 5. So all this time, row is going to have the value 0, and all this time we're going to be in this if statement. So now column has the value 2. So we check here if column is, if the remainder of dividing column by 2 is 1, so it's not. So we skip all of this, and we go into this else statement. Else, we're going to print this vertical line. And so column has the value 2 here, and we print the vertical line. Now we go into, we're still on the side of the for loop, and so column has the value 3. Now we check if we divide 3 by 2, Well, 2 fits in perfectly once into 3, and then we're left with 1. So we get a remainder of 1. And now we check if column is not equal to 5. Well, column is equal to 3. So we go into this if statement, and we print a space, and our final separation is none, so we stay on the same line. And so for 3, we printed this. For column equal to 3, we printed this. Now, we go out of this if statement, and we skip this else, because we've executed this if statement. And we also skip this else, because we've executed this if statement. Now, column takes on the value 4. We check, is 4 perfectly or not perfectly divisible by 2? Does it have a remainder of 1 when we divide it by 2? No. 2 fits in perfectly into 4, so 2, 4. So 2 fits in twice into 4. So we skip all of this if statement here, and we go into this else, and we print a vertical line, and we make sure that our final separation is none, so that we stay on the same line. So our separation is just going to be nothing. And so this gives us this, which makes us stay on the same line. And now column takes on the value 5. And then we go into here again. And now we check if column has a remainder of 1 if we divide it by 2. So 2 fits in perfectly twice into 5. And it also leaves a remainder of 1. So we have 2, 4, so that's twice. And then we have a remainder of 1. So we enter this if statement. And now we check if column is not equal to 5. Well, column is equal to 5. So we don't execute this statement, but we go into this else statement. And here we're going to print a space. And we're also going to print a new line, which is standard with the print function. So we don't indicate at the end of the print function that we don't want to print a new line, but rather that we do want to print a new line by not having anything. So that's the standard with the print function. At the end of the print, we print a new line. So for column having the value 5, we print a space and we print a new line. And now, since we've executed this if statement, we skip this else statement. And since we finished this loop, so column has the value 5, we go out of this loop, and now we're back here. But since we've executed this if statement, since row still has the value 0, we don't execute this else statement. So now, with row being the value 0, we've individually printed space, horizontal bar, horizontal line, space, horizontal line, space, a new line, which comes from this here. So we've individually printed each of these characters. And so that gives us our first row. And so since we're in this if statement, we skip the else, and now row takes on the value 1. So for row here, we have 0. So if row is 0, we executed all of this, which gives us this first row here. And now row has the value 1, so we check. When we divide 1 by 2, well, we get a remainder of 1, so the remainder of dividing 1 by 2 is not 0. So we don't execute this if statement. So we don't execute any of this. We skip all of this, and we go to the else. And here we print these 5 kind of horizontally dashed lines to act as a separator. And so here, for row having the value 1, we've gone into here. Now row takes on the value 2, and we check if we divide 2 by 2, our remainder is 0. Yep. So we go into here again. And now, with row having the value 2, we're going to start going through column 1 by 1 again. So column is now going to start at 1 again, and it's going to go up to, but not including 6. So column is going to take on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again. And each of these times, we're going to print a space if column has the value 1, 3, or 5. So if column is odd, we're going to print a space. And if column is even, or otherwise, if column is not odd, so else, if column is not odd, we're going to print a vertical line, just like we've done up here. So on our second row, or on our third row rather, our row which has value 2, but is actually our third row, since we started at 0 for the rows, we're going to print, or we're going to go through column again, since we go into this for loop again, and we're going to take on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1 up to but not including 6. So column is going to take on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for each of these values, if it's odd, it's going to print a space. And if it's even, it's going to print a vertical line, like we have here and like we've done up here. And so then we go out of the for loop again, and we don't execute the else because we've done this if statement. Now row takes on the value 3. And now if we divide 3 by 2, we get a remainder of 1. So our remainder is not 0. So we execute this else statement here. So with row having the value 3, we execute this else statement and we print these 5 horizontal dashes, which gives us this separator here, this horizontal separator. And so now row takes on the value 4. And now we check if we divide 4 by 2, do we get a 0 remainder? Well, we do, since 2 fits in perfectly twice into 4. And so we go into this if statement again here. And now inside the if statement, we enter this for loop again here. And now column, since we entered the for loop, column takes on the values starting at 1, going up to but not including 6. So column takes on the values 1 through 5 again. And each time column takes on an odd value, like we have in this if statement, we're going to print a space. So we print a space, and when column has an even value, we print the vertical line. So even, odd, odd, even, odd, even, odd. So this gives us our third and our final row, or technically our fifth and our final row, but our third and final writable row. And so what we've seen is that so we've created a for loop, and this for loop takes on the values ranging from 0 up to but not including 5, so up 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in this for loop, we've created another if statement. And every time we enter this if statement, we enter another for loop. And when we do that, our temporary variable takes on the values between 1 and 5. So every time we enter this if statement and every time we enter this for loop here, our column takes on the values between 1 and 5. It doesn't just take them on once and say, well, we've done this for loop once and we're not going to do it again. Every time we enter this if statement, we enter this for loop here. And even though our row value, for example, in our first loop, so our row is going to have the value 0, and our column is going to take on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then our row is going to have the value 1, and then we're going to execute the else statement. And then row takes on the value 2. And then we go into this if statement again here, and now column takes on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again, which gives us our second kind of writable line here, or our third effective row. And then, so all of this happens when row is equal to 2. And then when row takes on the value 3, we don't do this if statement, and we do this else statement, which prints us this horizontal separator here, or these dashed horizontal lines. And then when row takes on the value 4, we enter this if statement again here, and now column, for row having the value 4, column takes on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again. And for each of these values, we either print a space if it's odd, so 1, 3, 5, or a vertical line if it's even, so 2 and 4, which prints us character by character our final kind of row down here. And so we've seen a for loop here inside of another for loop. And so every time this for loop is started, the values start from the beginning again. Even though this loop goes from 0 to 4, every time we enter this for loop here, it starts again over, and it starts at 1 and it goes to 5. Yeah, so what this is called actually is, this is called a nested loop. So it's a loop within a loop. But the point is rather that we can see that we can use for loops inside of for loops, and what happens is that every time we enter this for loop, our loop inside here, this loop is going to start over. So even though this outside loop keeps going, so it takes on the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. When this outside loop has the values 0, 2, and 4, we run through this loop completely once. And so it kind of starts over. So it's executed once for the value 0. So when the value row has the value 0, then it's executed a second time when row has the value 2. So column takes on the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 when row is 0. Then it takes on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again when row is 2. And then when row is 4, column takes on the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again. So every time we start this loop inside here, we take on all of the values before row takes on the next value inside of its loop. Yeah, so this is really cool, and it can also be really useful. And it goes to show the principle of what happens when you put loops inside of loops. So we don't only execute a loop once, but we execute a loop every time it's called. And in this case, since the loop is inside of this loop, it's going to be called multiple times, which means we go through it multiple times. And we've used that to be able to print these writable rows character by character, rather than having to just kind of write out the whole row like we've done here. We were able to print them character by character. And this gives us also a lot of functionality in the future, and it lets us make things a lot more complicated, because it prevents us from having to write everything out like we did here, and it allows us to automate everything.